Okay, so we're on the impact of monetary and fiscal policy on aggregate demand. So we're just interested in one line on last chapter's graphs.
Okay, I figured out how the frogs are turning gay.
How are the frogs turning gay?
So it derives from the theory that the government is creating homosexuality. And Jones said, quote, the government is using juice boxes to make children gay to slow and eventually reverse the growth of the population. Then he says, when the juice boxes are disposed of, the chemicals in the juice boxes get into the water and turn the freaking frogs gay.
But nothing else that lives in the water? Not the snakes and the gators and the fish and
the frogs.
Just the frogs.
That's his quote.
So frog DNA must be very similar to human
How come
DNA.
apes
I don't,
aren't?
because apes don't get to drink juice
Oh
boxes.
yeah, that's
Yeah, dude. Wait, what about juice pouches?
Alrighty, let's go. How does the interest rate effect help explain the slope of the aggregate demand curve? How does the central bank use monetary policy to shift the aggregate demand curve? What are two ways that fiscal policy affects aggregate demand? And what are the arguments for and against using policy to stabilize the economy? So we've already talked about long-run effects of all of these things, right? We've talked about the long-run effects of fiscal policy, increasing and decreasing taxation, increase and decreasing government spending. Those are the two tools of fiscal policy. And if you do not have those concretely understood, get there before the exam, because there will be a lot of questions about fiscal policy and monetary policy. And on the exam, what they'll do is they'll give you a question that says, here's the situation. Unemployment is down, GDP has been declining, exports are, or exchange rates are high. What do you do? And you got to decide fiscal policy, monetary policy, how do I deal with this? So they leave it wide open for you. All right. Long-run effects of monetary policy. So now we're looking at short-run effects, which are all about AD.
That stands for aggregate demand, guys.
Wow.
It in fact does.
I thought it was
Athletic.
Anno Domini, the Latin. Yeah. All right.
not the disorder.
We don't use AD anymore. We use BCE and CE. Common Era and before the Common Era. Because to use AD and BC is to be a Euro-Christian centric global historical calendar, and that's insensitive.
Whoa, hey,
Sorry.
That stuck to the tape.
hey!
So who exactly were you threatening? Laura LaFawn?
Laura.
Who exactly were you?
Delaney!
Who exactly were you threatening, Lauren LaFawn?
Us here in macroeconomics do not condone the act of violence against other people.
Andrew, you were
Andrew,
doing
no.
something weird in England too.
Oh, so you were threatening Andrew?
You admit
Garrett was doing
You
this.
admit
In multiple classes?
Yeah.
Wow.
You're innocent until proven guilty. Stop saying it out loud.
Yeah, anything you say will.
Oh yeah, I actually earlier in the year I spilled coffee, like Delaney's own coffee on her, and she was so mad at me, and she goes, "What'd you say?" And I was like, and Miss Sire freaked out.
Was she as mad at you as Jared is at me right now?
Jared's not mad at you. Jared's mad at you.
Sorry, it was a
All right.
good story. I had to get to.
So what are the three reasons AD slopes downward? What are the three reasons aggregate demand slopes downward?
Hang on, give me a second.
Exchange rate
Exchange
effect.
rate effect and wealth effect. Yep. You guys are fast.
Roll. Which one of those is the most important here in the United States?
The wealth effect. The
Interest
interest
rate
rate effect. The exchange rate effect.
Well, way to blurt out all three of them in the hopes that you would eventually be right. It's the interest rate effect. Okay, Okay. So then we get to our supply-demand model, which puts it all together and shows us how monetary policy plays into that. All right. So now a theory. The theory of liquidity preference. This is where you prefer that your juice boxes be liquid.
Without the chemicals.
Without the chemicals.
I don't want to judge.
Extra. All
right. So what this is a real simple theory about interest rate. Interest rate is always lowercase r. Lowercase r. The interest rate is always going to adjust to balance the supply of money and the demand for money. Remember that the money supply is always fixed. It does not depend upon R, but it is set by the central bank, which is for us the Federal Reserve. Got to get a battery for my remote. What does money demand represent? What does the demand for money, what does that curve represent?
How much money do you want in pockets?
How much money people want in liquid form. Very good. So we all know Dayton learned at least one thing this year. All right. So we're going to suppose, for our purposes here, that household wealth is comprised of only two things. Your money, which bears you no interest because it's in your pocket and not in a bank, and bonds, which pay interest but aren't as liquid. That's your only wealth as a household. Got some sun yesterday.
A lot of it.
How'd you play?
I got second.
Just Shakespeare quotes.
Okay.
We'll take that fried.
So wait, the whole team got what?
Fried.
Fried?
Yeah, we're all.
It's probably really nice.
Because it was so nice and you didn't think about it being.
Yeah, it's hot.
All right, households' money demand reflects its preference for liquidity. So how much money they want tells us how much they think that they need to have on hand. For instance, think about your own household's preference for liquidity. Getting ready to leave on vacation. Is your money demand higher or lower than an ordinary day?
$1 bills for tips.
One.
Yeah,
That's for your waiters.
No.
I only have
Vacation.
$1 bills for you.
No,
You're
when
not
you
talking
go on,
about a
well, are
wedding.
we going in country or out of country?
In country.
Oh, out of country, you always bring ones. Yeah, that's the rules.
They would like to be tipped in American currency.
All
in lots of places.
inclusive, you tip in all ones.
Yeah, if you go to Mexico.
All right, so the variables that affect or influence money demand, what are those variables? I can read Y, R, and P, but what are they? Y is,
GDP.
R is,
Interest rate.
P is.
Price level. I've learned 3 things now.
That would be 4.
Oh.
2 + 2 is 4. Minus 1, that's 3 quick maths.
What the frick
People laugh, so.
All right,
is that? Yeah, not Joe.
so Y here is real income. Why is Y real income and not GDP?
Why is
Because
that?
you're changing it up.
Because real income is pretty much steady, right?
Yes.
Nice.
Another name for the same thing. Whether we call you Davis or Davy, same dude.
But
I dare you ever to try and call him Davy.
Oh, I do it all the time.
People call me Davey all the time.
Really?
I do it all the time.
Davey all the time.
All right. So, real income rises. What happens to money demand? Real income rose. What happens to money demand?
Goes
What is my next question?
Why?
Not that Y, but the 3-letter Y.
Because if you have more real income, so your purchasing power increases, so you want more money to be able to spend.
Just because my purchasing power increased, do I have to spend it?
No. Feel left.
But human behavior says people want to spend it.
Excellent.
Oh, David.
Did you just say, oh,
You
Davy?
win the lottery, you're telling me you're not going to go buy whatever
Tax
you want.
returns come out.
Want to buy more goods and services? In order to do that, You need more money. To get the money, what do? You go sell some of your bonds. So, an increase in Y results in an increase in money demand. Ceteris paribus.
Stop it, stop flashbacks.
I'm gonna get a tattoo on my forehead.
I actually wrote that
Ceteris paribus.
on my current event paper this last week. I wrote Ceteris
How do you
paribus.
do this?
So, when you are writing for the exam, ceteris paribus is far faster than all other things remaining constant or all other things being equal.
You just put CP.
No, they will not understand that.
Computer.
Though, set yourself up.
Current price.
Though, keep this in mind. Just because you identify an abbreviation that you're using on question 1 of the short answers, do not assume that the reader of question 2 has seen that. The readers only read one question the whole week that they're there.
So they all read
So
one,
identify
one, one.
abbreviations that you're using on each question that you answer. Re-identify them.
Like long run aggregates of 3,000.
No, they'll know that.
Oh, okay.
But he said CP. If I just want to say CP instead of ceteris paribus, then it's better if you're going to use it in question 1, use it in question 2 too. Delaney?
Oh no.
Oh. All right. Guess what?
Practice time.
You're almost to the end where we won't say that anymore.
No.
Yeah.
Oh man. And then the finals week.
All right.
No, that's that.
So now R rises, but Y and P are constant. What happens to money demand? Or if P rises, but Y and R are constant, what happens to money demand? So let's answer this one first.
R is the opportunity cost of holding money. Just so you guys know.
What's the interest rate? So
It went up.
Interest rate goes up. Wait, I
that
can't remember what this means.
decreases your.
Yeah, it decreases your money to make sure making more money on that money saved.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, so if I'm holding
Buy bonds.
money in my pocket, it's not earning me anything as the interest rate rose.
Well,
So
that money's not as
That's a
worth
one.
as much as if you were to put it in a bank.
right. So what
So that
should
means-
happen to my demand for money?
So it decreases.
Yeah, I should go run and put this in the bank so it can work for me.
The whole dollar.
I thought it was a $2 bill.
Or 2.
How many is there?
Whoa, whoa, whoa. I gotta get groceries tonight.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Make it right so
Make it rates and milk.
Actually, yes.
Yeah,
those TC.
Oh,
This
TC
is
so
literally
big.
threw dollar bills at prom.
So TC
Like,
was
oh,
with,
yeah.
so this kid TC was like, hey, we gotta circle everybody up. I was like, okay. So they circled everybody up, and he was like doing his dance moves, and then he didn't know what to do after that. So then he just pulled a bunch of money out and just started throwing it up in the air.
I'm so
And then he
mad.
just walked out. And he just walked out. I was like, TC, what are you doing? He was like, I just forgot how to dance. So I just did the money.
That was legendary.
alrighty. So the end result. How can we summarize this in one nifty sentence?
Yes. It was probably fake.
An increase in
Interest rate.
R results in
Decrease in money demand.
a decrease in money demand.
Ceteris paribus.
Ceteris paribus. You have to add the ceteris paribus. Da!
Ceteris.
We say hence.
Yes, I'm pretty sure that they'll give you lots of bonus points in the AP scoring if you use the word hence.
Hence.
Use big words. Thus resulting. And then
I like to
hence.
thus forth. I like to use big words.
I'm gonna use
Yes, definitely make up words too.
We's thou dust.
Alright,
And
so now
increases.
price has to risen, or price level has to risen,
Done.
but Y and R remaineth the same.
We get some Hamlet
What
in
is
here.
thy
Some William Shakespeare.
What happeneth to money demand?
Price level rises meaning that money demand increases because it costs more products.
You have to.
Because it costs me more,
No, it costs you mo.
Money.
more money to get my milk. So
Yeah.
I want more money.
More money.
More money, more milk. More money, more milk.
Because well, how do you know I want the same amount of stuff?
Because
GDP stays
Shut
up.
up.
Because Y remained constant.
Let's
As
go!
Y remained constant, that says that my desire to consume things hasn't changed. If Y had gone down, that would be a different
Take that
story.
test right now.
This goes back to all the chapters that I actually studied for. This is going good so far.
Until it comes to the last chapter.
All right. So you've already determined that. So put it in one nice, neat sentence for me.
When price level rises, money demand rises, ceteris paribus.
My demand.
How do you feel about that, Aiden? You're the master of the buffet.
You forgot hands.
Hungry.
You're hungry.
I'm hungry for more.
Didn't say hands.
You're hungry for more knowledge. How do you feel about money demand, though? Are you hungry for more money too?
Yes.
Ceteris paribus.
Ceteris paribus.
Paribus.
Citrus.
Citrus paribus.
Where'd Jake Paul in at?
Somebody who didn't take this class, whoever watched this or listened to this chaos, would be horrified.
on YouTube correctly.
No, it's
There are random guys who go back and comment on my history lectures that are up there, and they're like, you got these two artworks out of order in the Renaissance, and I'm just thinking to myself, you know what? These kids have never seen any art before at all, so they're lucky I even told them the name and showed them a picture. All right, so how do we determine the interest rate? You've seen this graph before, have you not?
We have not.
not
M is money supply,
Oh, then yes.
or money market.
See,
It's the money market. What's the first thing we know we can put in here?
demand.
Supply.
Supply. A long run.
The money supply as determined by the Fed. Okay. Always going to be vertical because that's how much money they're supplying no matter what the interest rate is. How much money you get. So how now do you suppose we determine the interest rate? When we put the demand curve in, we're going to have an equilibrium, which will tell us
At least there's one thing that's kind of consistent.
what?
I said at least there's one thing that's kind of consistent.
Equilibrium always results in something.
Yes.
There's no it depends. All right.
Wait, I thought.
There's not an
So the lower the interest rate, the greater the quantity of money demanded. Now, here's where I've talked to you about this before, where we have to draw two graphs side by side so that you can transfer information one to the other. When you draw those two graphs side by side, your axes need to be the same height. Your lines need to be the same. So do yourself a favor. If you're drawing it on blank paper, okay? If you're drawing your axes on blank paper, give yourself, before you even start drawing something, some dotted lines to make sure that you get your stuff equal. Okay? Help yourself out on this. And when you are doing the exam, they give you a lined booklet to write your short answers in. So you'll at least have some lines already there. But if you're sketching stuff out for yourself, make sure that you make sure they're even. Are you ready? Despite the fact that this will be initially confusing, this chapter is easily 20% easier than last chapter. Maybe 30%. Okay. So now look, it's two different graphs. It's two different graphs. Do you see that the graphs are graphing different things?
Yes.
The graph on the left, money market. The graph on the right is aggregate. All right.
So far, guys.
A fall in the price level is going to reduce money demand. So the fall in the price level is going to reduce money demand, which is going to give us a lower interest rate. when we get the lower interest rate, what do you get? When interest rates fall, what do people want to do? They don't necessarily want to take their money out. The lower interest rate, what does lower interest rate do to the cost of money? It decreases it, so what should increase correspondingly? Investment should increase. As investment increases, what should happen? Is AD going to go right? GDP is going to increase, and we're going to shift along aggregate demand. Here's what I would do if I were you. They didn't do this and it annoys me, but I've tried to change it and it screws the whole slide up. If I were drawing these, I would put those points at the same point across the graphs. And then these are at the same points.
That would make me mad.
That's how I was taught this concept. Price level. Price level decreases. Interest rate decreases. So what you're looking at is you're looking at the cause and effect of these changes on two different graphs. But they're moving together. But you can't graph them on the same graph. What are you confused about, Jonathan?
Like point on the AD curve shifting instead of the AD curve.
Okay. When I increases, when investment increases, investment is a component of GDP. So GDP is going to increase, and it is the increase in GDP which is reflected on the aggregate demand curve. Aggregate demand itself isn't increasing.
What shifts AD?
What does shift AD? Last chapter, tell me what shifts AD. Anything that actually shifts demand. Shifts aggregate demand. Consumer tastes and preferences. Number of consumers in the market. Yep. AD does not reflect GDP in and of itself. All right. So to get to our overall macroeconomic goals, the Fed can use monetary policy to shift aggregate demand. What is the Fed's monetary policy instrument? What can they change? Money supply.
Nice.
In shifting the money supply, they are thus changing the interest rate. The news is going to report to you the Fed just lowered the interest rate. That is so that the ordinary peons who haven't taken econ can understand. You now understand that the Fed didn't change the interest rate. The Fed changed the money supply.
So
But they didn't directly change the money supply. And they didn't change the interest rate that you're getting paid by your bank. What they did was they changed the federal funds rate, which is the rate at which banks borrow money from the Fed. And if you make it more expensive for banks to borrow money from the Fed, they're going to be less aggressive in loaning out money. Credit will be restricted, investment will decline, blah, 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 blah. So follow all of those logical steps. Okay? So change that federal funds rate, make it more expensive or less expensive for banks to borrow from one another, and that affects the bank's behavior with those who want to borrow money from the bank. So if they want to mess with the interest rate via the federal funds rate, they can do that. Then they can also directly impact the money supply by open market operations, which are the buying and selling of bonds. So, it's an old-fashioned thing, but you'll hear it said. Arrows in your quiver, meaning how many weapons can you draw? Okay, if we're going archery style. So in monetary policy, what are the arrows in the Fed's quiver? Name the two arrows.
Money.
Open market operations is one arrow. The other arrow is the federal funds rate. They can alter the money supply, they can alter the interest rate. Okay? Fiscal policy, Congress's arrows.
Government spending.
Government spending, one arrow. Taxation, the other arrow. Now, think about it. Those arrows can be aimed at one of two targets. When I pull my government spending arrow out, I can aim it at cut government spending, or I can aim it at increase government spending. With the taxation arrow, I can aim it at cut taxes or raise taxes. Okay? So each of those tools can be used two ways. Don't get confused and think that they have 4 tools. They have 2 tools, each of which gives them 2 options. Okay? You will get asked a question which presents a scenario. The government is economy is an expansionary period. Unemployment is at X%, and there is a indications of a recessionary action in the Asian economies. What action should you take? And you need to answer with an arrow from each quiver. Because very rarely do both sides of this equation not operate at the same time. Fiscal policy and monetary policy will both move. Which one reacts faster? Who is faster to draw an arrow and shoot?
Fed.
By far. Why?
Because you don't have to ask it.
Less red tape.
Nobody's got to agree to anything along partisan lines. Nobody's running for re-election in the Fed. They just do. Fiscal policy is painfully slow. It's almost always lagging. Almost always lagging. All right. So now the Fed's going to raise interest rates by reducing the money supply. What will they do in order to reduce the money supply? What action does the Fed take to reduce the money supply? They're going to buy bonds. They're going to take money out of your pocket and give you that slip of paper that is a bond.
Wait, that means they'd be selling you.
Yeah.
They're taking the money.
Yes.
And taking the money.
Wait, reduce the money supply. Yeah, they're selling bonds. Thank you. Yes, reduce money supply, selling bonds. Okay. So what happens on the graph when we reduce money supply? That was correct, Scott. That line slides left. What happens to the interest rate?
Increases.
Boom, like a rocket. So now, as a result of the increase in R, what happens to goods and services demanded? What happens to aggregate demand?
Price goes up. How?
You have a higher interest rate.
Consumption.
There's 2 possible reasons why consumption would decrease. 1, I have to borrow to spend money, and now it's more expensive to borrow to spend money. Or 2, I would rather have my money in the bank earning me that increased interest rate, so I'm going to cut my spending to make more money.
So does,
Either way.
does AD shift, or does it run along the curve?
It would be a long curve.
That's all it is. Whoa.
No, would the price level need to adjust to correct?
Wait, does AD shift, or does it just stay in the?
No, Alright, so
Just
prices
floats.
go up to
That's
correct-
not the whole thing.
It just floats.
No, no.
What?
AD shifts. Why does it shift one way and not shift the other way? That's annoying.
When interest rates increase, price level increases a lot. And investment decreases.
So you're looking at this curve here without the short run aggregate supply. But what happened to short run aggregate supply in this scenario if you graphed it all out? What happened to long run aggregate supply?
Didn't move.
Long run aggregate supply didn't move, it's still there at Y1.
Yeah.
What happened to short run?
It would decrease.
Why?
Because you have to convince that you wanna get.
Because borrowing money just got more expensive.
I don't know.
Just because we're not drawing all the other lines on the ASAD graph doesn't mean they're not there and doing what they do. So that's why AD shifted on this one and on the other. And the other one, when interest rates came down, what happened to AS? What happened to short run aggregate supply? It increased because money was cheap. Practice time! So you're gonna look to do two things for each of these scenarios I'm gonna give you. You're gonna tell me what the short run effect is on
Wait.
output. What?
Why did aggregate demand shift? I'm still confused. And not run along the curve. Consumer taste and preferences. Is that why? Or would it have been income change?
No.
Wait,
No, because that's
yeah.
not why it's shift. No, component of GDP that shifts along this.
Last time.
So why did people buy less?
Was it an income change?
No, because
Taste and preferences.
More efficient to save money because the interest
Yeah.
is higher.
You fell into the same trap. You just fell later. But why does consumption go down? Because aggregate demand decreased because consumers prefer to save rather than spend as a result of the increased interest rate. You just have to take all of the stepping stones along the way. Do you guys remember how complex demand determinants seemed so many months ago?
No.
And look at where you are now.
I heard they were pretty easy. They're so simple.
All right.
Yeah.
So right now we're just considering what monetary policy action should be taken. Okay? You got to tell me what is the short run impact on output. Another word for output is GDP. Okay? And what should the Fed do? Congress is going to try to balance the budget by cutting government spending. G's going to drop. Oh, but you know what? The bell's going to ring. We'll start here tomorrow.
Never mind.